The season was wrong. Autumn in the high basin country was supposed to arrive with a clean, sharp snap, a declaration of intent written in frost on the long grass and the sudden, aching blue of the sky. Instead, this year it seeped in like a low fever, a damp, clinging malaise that turned the air heavy and the light a weary, jaundiced yellow. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a verdict it already knew. At the heart of this decline lay the Thorne Ranch, and at the heart of the ranch lay Marcus Thorne, a man of 34 who looked a decade older, his face a map of erosion that mirrored the country around him. He stood on the bank of what had once been the lifeblood of his property, a creek that his father had claimed was the sweetest water in the territory. Now, it ran with a strange, deathly clarity, the stones on its bed coated in a slick, rust-colored film that shimmered with an oily iridescence. There were no water skeeters dancing on the surface, no darting minnows in the shallows. The silence was the most damning evidence of all. His cattle, what was left of them, refused the water unless driven by a thirst so desperate it overcame their instinct. And when they drank, they sickened. It was a slow, creeping rot, a wasting disease that stole the light from their eyes and the flesh from their bones before leaving them as still, skeletal monuments to his failure. It had started with 1, then 3, then a dozen. Now the count was lost in a fog of grief and mounting debt. He had tried everything his father had taught him, everything the neighboring ranchers had suggested. He had burned sulfur, moved the herd from pasture to pasture, bought expensive patent medicines from a traveling drummer that did nothing but thin his wallet. Nothing worked. The land was his inheritance, the bone-deep certainty of his identity, and it was dying under his stewardship. The pride that had been his spine was now a cage, trapping him with his own inadequacy. He was a capable man, a hard worker, but this was a quiet, insidious enemy he could not fight with a rope or a branding iron. It was a poison in the blood of the world, and it was taking him down with it. Marcus rode into dusty prosperity with the grim set of his jaw locked against the questions he knew he would face. The town was a collection of raw lumber and false fronts huddled against the vast emptiness, a place that measured a man's worth in the health of his herd and the weight of his word. By those metrics, he was a pauper. He tied his horse, the animal's ribs showing like the slats of a barrel, outside the mercantile, the motion automatic and devoid of its usual crisp efficiency. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of bulk cloth, coffee beans, and the cloying sweetness of horehound candy. He bought flour and salt, counting out the coins with a painful precision that did not go unnoticed by the storekeep. He was turning to leave, his shoulders braced for the walk of shame back to his horse, when a voice cut through the low hum of the store. "Marcus!" A moment it was Dr. Alastair Finch, the town's physician, a man whose quiet competence was a small anchor of stability in a precarious world. The doctor was in his late 50s, with spectacles perched on a nose that had seen too much weather and hands that were surprisingly delicate for a man of his profession. He motioned Marcus toward the back of the store, away from curious ears. "I heard about your latest losses," the doctor began, his tone devoid of pity, which Marcus was grateful for. "It's the same wasting sickness that took 3 of Peterson's head last month." Marcus just nodded, the muscles in his neck tight. Words were useless. "I have a thought," Dr. Finch continued, polishing his spectacles with a handkerchief. "It is unconventional." He paused, choosing his words with care. "My niece is staying with me. Adeline. Her father was a botanist. Not just a gardener, mind you. A man of science. He taught her everything. She understands the chemistry of the soil, the composition of water, the way things grow and the way they fail." Marcus felt a flicker of irritation. He was a rancher, not a farmer. "Doctor, with respect, my problem isn't weeds." "No," Finch said, his gaze steady. "Your problem is a poison. And a poison is a matter of chemistry." She was to be married, but the man, well, he proved to be a fool. She arrived here 2 weeks ago with 2 trunks and a mind that sees things others do not. She needs a purpose. You need a solution. It occurs to me that you might be able to provide one for each other. The suggestion hung in the air, absurd and insulting. A woman. A girl, really, left at the altar and sent away to the territories to be cared for by her uncle. He imagined a frail, weeping creature, steeped in perfume and heartbreak, wandering among his dying cattle. The image was so preposterous it was almost comical. "Thank you for the thought, Doctor," Marcus said, his voice flat and dismissive, "but I don't have time for botany." He turned and walked out of the mercantile, the shame he felt now mingled with a hot spike of indignation. He rode the long miles back to the ranch under a bruised sky, the doctor's words replaying in his mind, each repetition stoking his resentment. He was a thorn. His father and grandfather had broken this land, learned its rhythms through sweat and instinct, not from books. He would solve this himself, the way a man was supposed to. He would not be reduced to hiring a spinster to arrange flowers while his legacy crumbled. The ranch met him with its customary, suffocating silence. As he unsaddled his horse, a sound from the far pasture drew his attention, a low, guttural moan of pure misery. He ran, his boots stumbling on the cracked earth. It was his best bull, a magnificent animal he'd paid a year's profit for, the key to rebuilding his herd. It was on its side, legs kicking feebly, its great body convulsing. Its eyes, when it turned its head toward Marcus, were clouded with a pain so profound it seemed to steal the air from his lungs. There was nothing he could do. He stayed with the animal until the shuddering stopped, his hand resting on its cooling flank. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in garish shades of orange and purple, a beautiful death. In that moment, something inside Marcus broke. It was not a loud shatter, but a quiet, final crumbling of the pride that had sustained and blinded him. The bull was not a statistic. It was the future. And it was gone. He stood up, the twilight erasing the lines of his face, leaving only a silhouette of defeat. He walked back to the barn, saddled his weary horse again, and began the long ride back to town. He did not stop until he was standing on Dr. Finch's porch, the faint light from a lamp inside spilling onto the dusty boards. He knocked once, his knuckles scraping the dry wood. The door opened, and there was the doctor, looking not surprised, but simply expectant. "She will require a wage," the doctor said softly. "And a room in the main house. And you will do exactly as she says." No matter how strange it seems, Marcus looked at the ground, at his own cracked boots, unable to meet the man's eyes. "Yes," he said, the word a ragged whisper. "All right." Adeline Finch was 23, and the first thing Marcus noticed was not her abandonment, but her stillness. She stood in the doorway of her uncle's house, a small, straight-backed figure framed by the lamplight, and her gaze was not timid or sorrowful but disconcertingly direct. It was the gaze of an assessor. When she arrived at the ranch the next day, riding in the doctor's buckboard, she brought with her only one small leather valise and a canvas satchel that clinked with the sound of glass bottles. She wore a practical dress of dark calico and her hair was pinned back in a severe knot that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her features. She did not comment on the dilapidated state of the house or the bone-thin cattle that watched her with listless eyes. Her attention was elsewhere. She walked past the herd, past the barn, straight to the creek. Marcus followed a few paces behind, feeling like a trespasser on his own land. She knelt, not with the delicate hesitation of a town woman, but with the fluid economy of someone accustomed to studying the earth. She let the unnaturally clear water run over her fingers, then scraped a bit of the rust-colored film from a stone into a small glass vial. She uncorked another vial, this one filled with a clear liquid, and added a single drop to the water sample. It clouded instantly, turning a milky, toxic white. "Iron," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "And something else. Something alkaline. It's locking the nutrients in the grass. They're eating, but they're starving." She stood and surveyed the landscape, her eyes moving from the creek to the pastures, to the distant, hazy mountains. It was as if she were reading a language he did not know existed. She spent the rest of the day walking. She did not ask him questions. She took soil samples from the high pasture and the low meadow, crumbling the dry dirt between her fingers. She collected leaves from the cottonwoods by the creek and pulled up clumps of grama grass, examining their roots. She seemed less a person than a diagnostic tool, a quiet, methodical instrument of inquiry. That evening, she sat at his kitchen table, her vials and notes spread out before her. The silence in the house was dense, broken only by the hiss of the lantern. Finally, she looked up at him. The problem begins with the water, but it has infected everything, she stated, not as an opinion, but as a fact. The mineral content is poisoning the soil, which in turn poisons the grass. You cannot fix the cattle until you fix the land. And you cannot fix the land until you fix the water. Her plan, when she laid it out, was staggering in its audacity. It was not one thing, but a dozen things, all interconnected. The first step, she declared, was to stop the poison at its source. She had identified a small, upstream spring that fed into the main creek, its water tasting of metal. This was the origin. But it couldn't simply be dammed, that would only fester. It needed to be filtered. There is a deposit of blue clay 3 miles east, in the arroyo, she told him, consulting a small, hand-drawn map she had made. We will need to haul it here. By the wagonload. Marcus stared at her. Hauling clay from the arroyo was a week of back-breaking work for 2 men, let alone 1 man and a woman. Clay, he asked, the word sounding foolish in his own mouth. To filter a creek. It binds to the excess minerals, she explained patiently, as if to a child. We will build a series of settling ponds just below the spring, lined with the clay and layers of gravel and sand. The water will pass through them slowly, leaving the poison behind. It sounded like madness. Ranching was about cattle, grass, and fences. It was not about building mud ponds. His instincts, the generations of knowledge passed down to him, screamed in protest. This was farmer's work, tinkerer's work. But then he remembered the sight of his bull dying, the feel of its last shudder. He remembered the humility of his ride back to town. He had made a promise. Show me where to dig, he said, his voice rough. The work was brutal. From dawn until dusk, he drove the wagon to the arroyo, dug out the heavy, dense clay, and hauled it back. Adeline worked alongside him, her slight frame belying a surprising strength and an inexhaustible stamina. She directed the construction of the ponds with the precision of an engineer, marking out dimensions with stakes and twine, ensuring the grade was just right. While he dug, she was busy with the herd. She prepared a mash of oats, molasses, and a complex mixture of dried herbs she had brought in her satchel. She forced the foul-smelling concoction down the throats of the sickest animals, her hands gentle but firm. She brewed a dark, bitter tea from willow bark and yarrow, and mixed it into their water troughs, bypassing the creek entirely. She was relentless, a quiet storm of focused energy. Every action had a purpose, every ingredient a reason. Marcus watched her, his initial skepticism slowly being eroded by the sheer, undeniable force of her conviction. He was exhausted, his muscles screaming, his hands raw. He was doing work that felt utterly alien to him, following the orders of a woman half his age. And for the first time in a year, a tiny, fragile sliver of something that felt like hope began to pierce the gloom. The news of his new hired hand spread through the basin like a grass fire. When Peterson and McCoy rode over from their neighboring ranches, they found Marcus not mending fences or rounding up strays, but hauling mud like a common laborer, taking direction from a slip of a girl. They sat on their horses at the edge of the pasture, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. Heard you had some trouble, Thorne, McCoy said, a smirk playing on his lips. Didn't figure the solution was a housekeeper. Marcus just kept digging, the rhythmic scrape of his shovel the only reply. That's Dr. Finch's niece, ain't it? Peterson added. The one who got sent home? Heard she's got funny ideas. Adeline, who was tamping clay into the base of a new pond, didn't even look up. Her focus was absolute, an invisible wall that their mockery could not penetrate. Their presence was a poison of a different kind, one that fed the last vestiges of Marcus's wounded pride. He felt the heat rise in his neck. But then he looked at Adeline, her face smudged with dirt, her expression one of serene concentration, and the anger subsided, replaced by a strange sense of loyalty. These men saw a jilted girl, he was beginning to see a general marshalling her forces for a war. They left after a few more minutes of unanswered jibes, and the silence they left behind was a relief. The mockery solidified the ranch into an island, just him and her against the world's disbelief. A few days later came the first sign. It was small, almost unnoticeable. A calf, so weak it had been unable to stand for a week, was on its feet, wobbling but upright, drinking the herbal brew Adeline had prepared. Its eyes, which had been dull and sunken, had a spark of life in them. Marcus stood and watched it for a long time, a knot tightening in his throat. It wasn't a miracle. It was just one calf. But it was more than he had been able to accomplish in a year. The next proof came from the water itself. After a week of flowing through the series of clay-lined ponds, the water that trickled out into the main creek bed was different. The oily sheen was gone. Adeline took another sample in a glass vial and held it up to the light. It was still not perfect, but it was clearer, cleaner. She showed him how a drop of her testing liquid now caused only a faint cloudiness, not the thick, immediate curdling it had before. "It's working," she said, and for the first time, a small smile touched her lips. It transformed her face, softening the severe lines of concentration. That evening, as he ate the simple meal she had prepared, a profound quiet settled over him. The laughter of his neighbors seemed distant and irrelevant. The proof was not in their opinions, but here, on his land. It was in the slow, steady gait of a recovering calf. It was in the changing chemistry of the water. It was small. It was undeniable. And it was just the beginning. The rhythm of their days fell into a pattern dictated by the land and the work. The hard physical labor of hauling clay and digging trenches was replaced by the equally demanding tasks of land management. Adeline insisted they move the entire herd to the north pasture, a scrubby, overlooked section of the ranch that Marcus had always considered second-rate. "This good land needs to rest," she explained, gesturing to the overgrazed meadow near the house. "The soil is exhausted. We have to let it heal." It was another inversion of everything he knew. A rancher used his best grass. But he complied, building a new fence line with a weary resignation that was slowly turning into trust. They worked in a silence that was no longer strained but companionable, a shared space built of mutual effort. He learned to anticipate the tools she would need, handing her a spade or a bucket without being asked. She, in turn, began to ask his opinion on the temperament of the herd, deferring to his innate knowledge of the animals. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, he found her not in the kitchen or with the cattle, but sitting on the porch steps, a piece of charcoal in her hand, sketching on a piece of scrap lumber. He expected a drawing of a flower or a bird. Instead, he saw a complex diagram of his own ranch, divided into a grid. "What is that?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She looked up, startled. "It's a plan," she said. "For rotation. If we divide the main pasture into 4 sections and graze them in sequence, the land has 3 seasons to recover for every 1 season it is used. The grass will grow deeper roots. It will hold water better. Over time, the soil will regenerate itself." She spoke of the land not as a resource to be exploited, but as a partner to be respected, a living system that required care. He sat on the step below her, listening as she explained the intricate dance of sun, water, soil, and grass. It was the longest conversation they had ever had that wasn't about an immediate task. He was struck by the clarity of her mind, the way she saw the world as a series of interconnected relationships. He saw a grid on a piece of wood, she saw a blueprint for a sustainable future. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the smudge of charcoal on her cheek, the earnest light in her eyes, the quiet confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with knowledge. A feeling he couldn't name, a warmth that had nothing to do with the dying sun, spread through his chest. It was respect, but it was deeper than that. It was the startling realization that this quiet, determined woman was not just saving his ranch. She was rebuilding his world. The second spring arrived not with a fever, but with a deep, cleansing breath. The rains came, soft and steady, and the land drank deeply. On the Thorn Ranch, the resting pastures, left fallow under Adeline's decree, responded with an astonishing vigor. The grass came in thick and green, a vibrant carpet studded with clover and vetch she had painstakingly seeded the autumn before. The cattle, now grazing on the first of the rotated plots, were transformed. Their coats were sleek, their eyes bright, their bodies filling out with a healthy weight that brought an ache of profound relief to Marcus's chest. The creek ran clear and sweet, the clay ponds doing their silent, ceaseless work. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was Peterson, the rancher who had openly mocked him. He approached not with the swagger of a neighbor dropping by, but with the hesitant, downcast posture of a man bearing bad news. He dismounted at the fence line, his gaze taking in the healthy Thorn cattle, then his own dusty, trail-worn boots. "Thorn," he began, his voice rough with an emotion Marcus recognized as defeat. I lost another 6 head. The wasting sickness. It's worse than ever. He wouldn't look at Marcus directly. "My wife, she said I should come talk to you. I saw your herd at the river crossing last week. I ain't seen cattle that healthy in 2 years." The request was unspoken but hung heavy in the air. The moment was thick with the memory of past insults. The old Marcus would have savored it, would have delivered a cold, satisfying refusal. But the man standing there now was different, reshaped by a year of humility and hard-won knowledge. He looked toward the house, where Adeline was tending her herb garden. "It wasn't me," Marcus said simply. "It was her. You'll have to ask her." He watched Peterson walk, hat in hand, toward the small figure kneeling in the dirt. He saw Adeline listen patiently, her head tilted. There was no triumph in her posture, only a quiet, serious attention. After a long conversation, she returned to where Marcus was standing. "He wants me to look at his water," she said. "I told him it would cost him $1 a day, plus the cost of any supplies." It was a fair price, but a firm one. It was a declaration that her knowledge had value. "And what did he say?" Marcus asked. "He agreed," she replied. The following week, Adeline spent 3 days at the Peterson ranch. She diagnosed the same mineral imbalance and drew up a plan for a smaller, simpler filtration system. Peterson and his sons, who had once sneered at Marcus, now followed her instructions with the desperate focus of converts. The news rippled through the territory. The story of the jilted girl from back east began to change. She was no longer Finch's girl or Thorn's Folly. She was Adeline, the woman who understood water. By the second summer, the transformation was no longer a matter of small signs, but a profound and undeniable reality. The Thorn Ranch was an island of lush, managed prosperity in a basin still struggling with drought and decline. The cattle were not just healthy, they were fat. The calf survival rate, once a source of constant dread, was now the highest in the territory. But Adeline's vision extended beyond mere survival. She saw the healthy herd not as an end, but as a beginning. "We have a surplus," she announced one evening, after they had finished tallying the new calves. "Selling them on the hoof gets us market price, but the real value is in the quality. We should preserve the meat ourselves." She had read about salt curing techniques, not the crude methods used by homesteaders, but a more refined process involving specific salt-to-meat ratios, careful aging, and the use of aromatic herbs to infuse the beef with a unique flavor. She designed a small smokehouse, and Marcus built it to her exact specifications. They worked together, butchering a prime steer and beginning the patient, methodical process of curing. They packed the cuts in coarse salt and a mixture of dried rosemary and thyme from her garden, then aged them in the cool, smoky darkness of the new building. Weeks later, when they cut into the first piece of cured beef, the result was astonishing. The meat was a deep, rich red, marbled with creamy fat, and the flavor was complex and savory, unlike any jerky or hardtack beef Marcus had ever tasted. It was a delicacy. On their next trip to prosperity, they brought a sample to the mercantile owner, who tasted it, his eyes widening in surprise. He bought their entire stock on the spot, offering a price that was nearly double what the live animal would have fetched. Word spread to the territorial capital, and soon orders were coming in from hotels and wealthy merchants. The Thorn Ranch was no longer just a cattle operation, it was a brand. One evening, Marcus stood on the porch, looking out at the landscape. He saw the neat grid of the fenced pastures, the clean line of the creek, the healthy cattle grazing peacefully, the wisp of smoke rising from the new smokehouse. He finally understood. It wasn't the clay ponds, or the rotating pastures, or the herbal remedies, or the salt curing. It was all of it. It was the system. Adeline had not applied a single cure, she had healed an entire ecosystem, restoring the intricate connections between water, soil, grass, and animal. She had seen the ranch not as a collection of assets, but as a single, living organism, and she had brought it back to life. The third autumn arrived crisp and clean, just as it should. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a brilliant, defiant gold, their leaves shimmering against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The land was no longer holding its breath, it was exhaling a deep sigh of contentment. The Thorn Ranch had become a destination, a quiet landmark in the territory. Other ranchers, men who had once scoffed, now made the long ride to ask for advice, which Marcus now directed to Adeline as a matter of course. She would listen patiently and then explain the principles of water filtration or soil regeneration, sharing her knowledge not as a secret to be hoarded, but as a truth to be spread. She never taught anyone how to fire a rifle or a pistol, her power was of a different, more fundamental kind. It was the power to make things grow. The house, once a hollow shell echoing with failure, was now a home. The kitchen was filled with the scent of baking bread and drying herbs. The rooms were clean, and the windowsills held pots of geraniums. It was a place of quiet, productive peace. The partnership between Marcus and Adeline had settled into a seamless union of complementary strengths. He was the hands, the muscle, the deep, instinctual knowledge of the animals. She was the mind, the architect, the scientific understanding of the earth. Their conversations were no longer just about work, but drifted easily into shared hopes, quiet jokes, and the comfortable silences of people who understand each other without words. One evening, they stood together on the porch, watching the last light fade from the hills. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and rich earth. He had paid off his debts. The ranch was more profitable than his father could have ever dreamed. But the transformation that mattered most was the one that had taken place inside him. The brittle pride was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence rooted in competence and partnership. "I never properly thanked you," he said, his voice low. She turned to him, her expression calm and unreadable in the gathering dusk. "You didn't need to," she replied. The work was the thanks he knew, in that moment, that the story people told about them was wrong. The gossips in town spoke of the desperate rancher and the abandoned bride he'd saved. But he knew the truth. He looked at this calm, capable woman who had faced her own desolation and had chosen not to wither, but to create. He saw the architect of his redemption, the quiet force who had taught him that true strength wasn't about dominance, but about understanding. It was about seeing the whole system. He had not saved her. She, in every way that mattered, had saved him. "Adeline," he said, the name itself feeling like a revelation. Stay, it was not a command or a proposal, but a simple statement of fact, as essential as water and soil. She looked out at the thriving land they had healed together, and then back at him. A slow smile spread across her face. "I'm home, Marcus,"